We were just kind of wondering, basically, these birds are kind of on a stopover from a longer trip down south. They come from the north. If you could tell us a little bit about what they're doing in Indiana, what they do at Jasper-Pulaski.
Yes, they're in migration, and the sandhill crane is one of the many species of birds that migrates from north to south in the winter and from south to north in the spring. And these birds are in migration, as you noted. They are, the sandhill crane is actually, there are several different subspecies, and then within the subspecies there are several different populations. This particular crane that comes through Indiana is called the eastern population of the greater sandhill crane. Now obviously that should bring two things to mind. One, since this is the eastern population, there must be western populations, which there are. Also, another thing that should trip a trigger in your mind is, since we said greater sandhill crane, there must be something that is not as great, and those are called the lesser sandhill cranes. They are all the same species. Both the greaters and the lessers are migratory. There are several non-migratory sandhill crane populations, the most notable of which is the Florida sandhill crane, which lives in Florida, the Mississippi sandhill crane, which is endangered, lives in primarily Mississippi and the Biloxi area, and the Cuban sandhill crane, which is the most endangered of the sandhill cranes, and they live in Cuba. And those three are non-migratory. All the other sandhill cranes are migratory. The most famous is probably the lesser sandhill crane, which nests all the way from Siberia and Asia across the Aleutian Island chain into Alaska, northern Canada, and even into southern Canada. And those cranes migrate through the central plain states, and they have a major staging area in Nebraska in the spring along the Platte River, and there are several 100,000 of those birds. They winter from Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and Mexico, and then they return again in the spring to their nesting areas. This eastern population of the greater sandhill crane nests primarily in the three states in the United States: Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Wisconsin is probably the core nesting state in the United States, and then a little bit into southern Canada, into Manitoba and Ontario. The pairs nest typically for life. They usually lay 2 eggs, and more often than not, only one of the chicks survives. And the reason for that is that the sandhill cranes, unlike the majority of other birds, nest after they've laid the first egg. Most birds nest after they lay all the eggs they're going to lay, after they lay the entire clutch. So all those birds hatch at the same time. Sandhill cranes, on the other hand, since I said nest or begin incubating once they lay the first egg, and they typically lay 2, there's a 24 to 48 hour difference between the hatching of the 2 chicks. So oftentimes the younger chick doesn't survive because the sandhill cranes are able to leave the nest soon after they hatch, and the younger bird just often isn't able to keep up. So when the people come to view the cranes here, they'll often see cranes in groups of 3 and 4, and typically that's a family unit. And you can tell it in the fall because the young cranes do not have this red cap that you see here. It's kind of a little rusty color from feather colors. And this red cap is actually an unfeathered area, and the red that you see is actually blood in the veins close to the surface of the skin.
Wow, really?
And the young birds, the ones that were born this year or hatched this year, do not have that red cap. They also don't have, well, once a person comes here and sees the cranes or goes to a website and listens to them, they have a very distinctive sound. And they have lots of different calls that they make, actually. And if you study them long enough, you can figure out what lots of those calls actually mean. But the young birds that were hatched this year don't have the same call. They have a little whistle, and you can hear that too when you come to see the cranes. So once the cranes nest on small to large wetlands in the areas north of us. And then as summer progresses and the birds learn to fly, they gather together in small flocks and then somewhat larger flocks, and then begin their migration in the fall. And they arrive here at Jasper-Pulaski. Some birds may stay 2 or 3 months, depending on when they arrive. The later arrivals, and we're not even close to the middle of the migration, which is usually late November, early December, those later birds may stay a shorter period of time before flying on to the principal wintering states. Now are Wisconsin and Georgia were the 2 historic ones, and now they are also wintering in southern Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, and even Alabama. There's a major wintering area that's developed in eastern Tennessee along the Hiwassee River north of Chattanooga. And there's a large wildlife area there that the cranes have now began to winter at. And at one time, all the cranes left northern Indiana, but we have up to 10,000 cranes that winter here now. The cold doesn't seem to bother them. They just stand on the ice, or once after a certain period of time when everything's frozen, the cranes will actually roost in the fields. Now a little bit about what the cranes do once they arrive at Jasper-Pulaski. Cranes require both wetlands for their nesting and their nighttime roosting, and then during the day they feed primarily now in agricultural lands or surrounding upland type lands that are open. So when the cranes arrive here, they roost in the wetlands at Jasper-Pulaski at night, and then in the morning they fly out to the surrounding private land to feed, and then in the late afternoon and evening they return to the Fish and Wildlife area to roost again for the night. Now, a behavior that they've developed in the use of this area is a large number of cranes will stop in goose pasture before flying into the wetlands to roost for the night. And that is where the public observation area is. It's in that field where they stop before flying into the roost at night. And so you can oftentimes see at peak population several thousand cranes in goose pasture before they fly into the roost at night. So that's the nutshell of.
As far as feeding goes, they eat insects.
They eat a wide variety of food, but obviously there aren't a lot of insects available in the winter, so they're eating insects, bugs, berries, parts of plants. During part of the year they're eating a lot of grain and seeds. There are still some grubs in the soil that they may probe for in the fall, in the winter if the ground's not frozen. But so they eat a wide variety of foods.
And I understand because of that behavior they can sometimes be considered agricultural pests to owners of land who might not want.
Yes, there's a couple, particularly in the breeding areas, primarily in Wisconsin. There is some crop depredation, but they're working on various research programs to try and treat the seed and do other things that will discourage the cranes from actually eating the planted seed. In our area, they're not too much of a problem crop-wise. There may be some damage to winter wheat that's planted in the fall. Where the cranes congregate, there may be some damage to the fields or ditch banks because their feet they got big long toes and they're walking up and down ditch banks, and they can actually cause trenches that will eventually cause soil erosion along the ditch bank. So, but other than that, they're not too much of the crane itself is not a problem. What is more of a problem in our area is not the cranes so much as the people that come to see the cranes. We estimate up to 30,000 people a year come to see the cranes, and particularly in October and November when there's large number of people. I'm not sure why, but people don't seem to respect private property rights, and so they trespass. And there's, in some places, there's a traffic hazard where people just park and block the road because there's no place to pull off, and so that's a problem. But
They trespass onto those private areas?
yes,
away?
mhm.
Okay.
Try and get closer to the birds, which
Okay.
usually doesn't work because as soon as you start walking towards them, they fly away.
Right.
And one of the reasons you can see them oftentimes very close here on the Fish and Wildlife area is because they are, as long as the people stay in the viewing area, the cranes are used to those people being there, and they aren't bothered by them.
And it's
But if
definitely
somebody walked out in the field, then they'd all fly
right.
away.
It's definitely advisable to bring binoculars.
Yes, yes, yes. If
I
you have
believe-
binoculars, bring them. Warm clothes. Like today, it's not particularly cold, but it's really windy out there. But, you know, the wind chill would get you pretty cold.
Does that have any effect on their, flying? Do they tend to lay low more when it's really windy like this?
Yes, they probably don't fly as much when it's really windy. But back to the binoculars, we do have viewing telescopes at the observation area, so a person that didn't bring binoculars would be able to view the cranes. Now we have a large elevated platform for viewing the cranes, and it'll hold quite a few people. So.
One thing I noticed, that red patch on the head, it kind of reminds me of whooping cranes, and I understand those are extremely endangered. The conservation status of these is, I'm thinking, a little better, or is it are
Yes.
they stable, or
Yes.
are they doing really well?
The greater and the lesser sandhill crane are both doing quite well. But you're right, the whooping crane is endangered, and there's a variety of programs to try and expand that population. And since you mentioned, there are 15 species of cranes in the world, and they all have some kind of red on their head. All 15
Okay.
species.
Is there anything, you mentioned a little bit about what you would want people to know coming out to the property, respect private property, come to the officially sanctioned Fish and Wildlife Area viewing area. Anything else you would want people to know if they plan to visit?
A couple of things. One, that there is a check-in required, that each person that comes to view the Sandhill cranes or to do any other activity needs to sign in at the check station, and there's a self-service area set up where a person can do that. One thing that a lot of people don't realize, that this is a Fish and Wildlife area within the Division of Fish and Wildlife, which is one of the many divisions within the Department of Natural Resources, and our charge here is to provide hunting opportunities. And that is the main reason we're here, is to provide places for people that want to hunt, and which means our funding comes from the sale of hunting licenses and from a federal program that was passed in 1937 called the Pittman-Robertson Act, which placed excise taxes on guns and ammunition, and then later some other equipment was added. But then that money comes back to each individual state based on the number of hunting licenses they sell. So we use what are called in government budget circles dedicated funds. That's all they can be used for. And we do use on occasion, we have some funds from other sources, but primarily from hunters is where our funding comes from.
The cranes coming to this spot, is that sort of like a generational, instinctual thing, or is it just because it happens to be a very accommodating spot?
Both.
Okay.
Both. Historically, this eastern population of the greater Sandhill crane were in very low numbers. Through the 1800s and even into the early 1900s, people needed to eat. I mean, we didn't have supermarkets like we have today, where you could go buy the food you were going to eat. Most food was sold on the open market, and a lot of that food was wild game. And cranes and waterfowl were species that were harvested in large numbers. It was what we call today, if you look back in history, it's called market hunting. And it's not what hunting is today. The word market gives you that little hint that these were going to the market. So they used different types of equipment, and one of the things they used were punt guns, or large caliber guns, and they loaded these huge barrels with anything you could think of, nuts, bolts, nails, and they shot these into large flocks and harvested this game that was then taken to the market and sold. And not only waterfowl, but sandhill cranes, or some species of waterfowl and sandhill cranes became quite endangered at that time, and the Sandhill crane was listed. The Sandhill crane was never on the endangered list, but it was on the I forget what the next level up. Anyway, they were protected for a long period of time, and they were in quite low numbers. But due to when wildlife managers understood that habitat was the most crucial thing for not only cranes but all critters, us included, for their survival, then we were able to, instead of raising critters and throwing them out there and hoping they would live, that we understood they had, what was more important was a place to live that met the proper requirements. So as habitat was protected, as hunting was halted on the sandhill cranes, then the populations began to increase. And cranes are traditional critters. They go to the same places year after year, both to nest and to winter and to migrate. The migration route is actually learned. The young birds learn the route from the adults. So, those small number of birds that use this area as the population began to increase continued to use it, and their offspring did, and their offspring and offspring. Now today, as the population has increased to quite high numbers, it's probably easily in excess of 50 to 60,000. The cranes are using a much wider area than just Jasper-Pulaski. There's actually cranes that are stopping in migration west of the property all the way over to southern LaPorte County, just north of the Kankakee River. So the cranes are using a much wider area in their migration, and it may, at some point, and it may already be occurring, may impact the number of cranes that actually come to Jasper-Pulaski, which is probably a good thing in terms of the health of the cranes, because then they're using a much wider area. It's probably not as a good a thing for the people to come to see the cranes, because they won't be seeing the large numbers.
Okay. Just one more thing I was a little curious about. On the site, you guys post counts every so often of the numbers at the site. One of the counts, I think from maybe the 16th, seemed to suggest the numbers might be a little lower than usual. Does that depend on the year? Maybe they come a little later as in the year, or could there be lower numbers already?
That depends somewhat on the year, and it may also be a factor, as I mentioned, that the birds are spreading out more. But this, other than yesterday and today, this has been a pretty mild fall. We saw a snowflake a couple weeks ago, but it wasn't at all cold.
Right.
And there hasn't been any cold weather until recently.
Okay.
And cold weather is one of the triggers for migration. There are more than just cold weather as migration triggers, but that is definitely one of them. And just the last 2 days, a lot of cranes have started moving.
Okay.
And I actually got an email. I asked a guy that lives, a biologist north of us in Minnesota, and he said there were 40,000+ cranes still in Minnesota and Wisconsin. So, which indicates that there's a lot of migration yet to occur. But those numbers, our numbers have just fluctuated around 7,000 to 8,000 this year, and so time will tell if they actually go up.
Okay. The last thing I would just ask is, is there anything else you'd want people to know about the cranes, the property, any frequently asked questions you'd like to get the answers out there?
Well, I think as far as the frequently asked ones, I've answered most of those, but I might elaborate a little bit more on the hunting. The lesser sandhill crane is now hunted again from Alaska all the way through the Central Plain states into Mexico, with the exception of the state of Nebraska. It's the only Midwestern state that doesn't have a season. The eastern population of the greater sandhill crane, this guy, they have just completed in the last couple of years a management study which indicates that this population can withstand hunting pressure, and they set up a mechanism for the states from in this flyway from Minnesota all the way to Florida to establish seasons in their respective states. And there's a whole set of rules and things that must be accomplished prior to actually having the season. Indiana has opted not to pursue it at this time for whatever reason. Kentucky has pursued it and will have a season unless it's stopped by a court injunction. Tennessee began the initial work for a season but withdrew their proposal because of public pressure. Minnesota is also pursuing a season on the graders. They have a season on the lessers that migrate through the Central Plains states. So the population has done quite well, and since we have that opportunity to hunt them, at some point Indiana will be pursuing a season.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for talking with us.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you, Ron.